Welcome again, everybody here, physically present, but not only physically present, also present in a deeper sense of the word, and everybody who is elsewhere on the planet. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, it'll be the present moment. Except if you're in Australia or New Zealand, where it's tomorrow already. Those are the only people who are continuously experiencing tomorrow, the future. You may have heard the Taoist saying, I don't know how to pronounce it exactly in Chinese, Wu Wei, translated as sitting quietly doing nothing. One of the highest virtues in Taoism, the ability to sit quietly doing nothing. This is one way I can translate. Another translation could be actionless activity, and all kinds of different translations. And every translation is another way of looking at it. So first of all, it means the ability to enjoy just being, to become comfortable with being and to be aware of being. Not that awareness of being are two different things, but when we talk about it, they become two different things. So the ability, and you may be surprised that many people are very uncomfortable. They cannot tolerate sitting quietly doing nothing, except when they're so tired they're already half asleep, or they've just taken some alcohol or some other substances, in which case all their faculties, the mind is not that active anymore because it's been dulled by some kind of substance. And then perhaps, maybe they can sit quietly doing nothing, but soon they will move to complete unconsciousness, like this. But in normal conditions, many people find it very uncomfortable. They believe something is very wrong if they sit quietly doing nothing, or they feel the unease that is always in the background whenever they are active. When they're not active, the unease comes to the foreground. And then they have to cover it up again with some kind of activity, often very pointless. They take out their phone, and just in case there might be something there. So this is a relatively recent thing that gives you a chance to never be sitting quietly doing nothing, because the moment you sit and there's nothing to do, you get out your phone. In the past, well, before these devices were invented, you had to do something else, find a magazine, or there might not have been anything around. Then you were stuck with yourself. And for many people it's very uncomfortable to be stuck with themselves. What do I do now? And if they can't do anything, thinking accelerates. This is also kind of doing. And that is part of the unease. And there was a French philosopher whose name I don't remember, perhaps Pascal or somebody like that, who said all the evils of humanity can be traced back to one simple thing, and that is a human being's inability to sit quietly in a room. Of course, it sounds a little strange, almost. What do you mean all the evils of humanity can be traced back or have their cause in a human being's inability to sit quietly in a room? Now, at first it doesn't make much sense, but if you look more deeply, the implications behind sitting quietly in a room, it means in order to be able to sit quietly in a room, quietly meaning you're not just moving or not moving much, but it refers also to the mind. If the mind is not quiet, you're not sitting quietly in a room. So what it really means is connectedness with being. Sitting quietly in a room stands for connectedness with being. And so then it begins to make sense, that saying, the human being's inability to be connected with beings. They are disconnected from themselves. And the interesting thing is that perhaps the very first of the ancient Greek philosophers, Pythagoras, who was actually a spiritual teacher, as many of them were, he all used the same kind of expression. It's I don't remember the exact quote, but it said, men go back and forth encountering all kinds of troubles, and it's all due to the fact that they are disconnected from themselves. Let's see, that was a long time ago. 500 BC, 2,500 years ago. They are disconnected from themselves. Again, pointing to the same thing, the essence, identity. And you yourself may remember times when you found it disconcerting to be alone somewhere with nothing to do. And now that has changed, of course, because many of you, if not all, actually enjoy sitting quietly in a room. It doesn't have to be for hours on end. You don't have to overdo it. Nothing in excess. Very wise, again, from ancient Greece. One of the fundamental sayings of the philosophers, nothing in excess. Even the best thing becomes bad when you do it, take it too far. So that's a good practice, to just be and contemplate the world around you for just a little while. Well, it doesn't have to be in your room, it could be any room or no room. It could be outside, you're on a bench, or on a tree trunk, or on the grass, you're sitting or standing, and you take it all in. It's a contemplative moment, and it's beautiful, and there are always now the dimensions of you're aware of your sense perceptions, you're acutely aware, you're fully present in the here and now, but you're not only present outside through sensory perception, you're also present within. And the present within has, one could say, different levels. On one level, you're present within by having the ability to know what your mind is doing. So if a thought comes, you realize it's a thought and it's fine. You don't fight anything. A thought comes up. And many thoughts that come up have a gravitational pull. They want more, they want your attention. And very often a thought that comes up, it may be totally disconnected from where you are, nothing to do with where you are. It could be something where you will be next week. Or it could be something that yesterday you said to somebody, or somebody said to you, or more likely, something that you should have said to somebody yesterday, but you didn't. And then you play the whole thing in your mind, and you're lost again without knowing it. So if you catch a thought as it arises, you notice it wants to pull you. It says, come this way, because it wants to become amplified through your attention. So when you follow the thought, every thought is a little being, it comes up, an energy formation, consciousness that had taken this particular temporary form of this thought, and every thought says, come this way. And if you're not aware, then every thought immediately grabs your attention and pulls you along. I'm acting it out now, but of course normally you don't do like this, but that's what happens inside you. And you're far gone. So you're aware, you're present within. Your thought comes, and it's a thought. It's the cloud on the blue sky. The blue sky is the space of awareness in this analogy. The blue sky is the inner space of awareness. And then thoughts come, and they drift in, and then they evaporate. But if you don't realize that it's just a thought that comes, and many thoughts pretend to be extremely important in this moment. You have to think about this now. It's going to be, what's going to happen next week or next year? Or what, you have to replay this thing in your mind that happened last week. 10 years ago, perhaps. But you have to replay it in your mind now. So thought, again, has a very deceptive nature of thought, is that thought pretend, one of the ways in which it draws you in, it says, this is important, you need to think about this. But of course, in that moment, it's not important. You don't need it whatsoever, you don't even want it, but there it is. And the cloud arises in the blue sky, and then if you don't realize that, then if you follow the cloud gets, very quickly the cloud of thought gets bigger. And before you know it, the sky is totally overcast. You can't even see the blue sky anymore. It's just clouds, thoughts. And so you didn't, because you followed this little cloud where it wanted you to go, and you followed it, and then it very quickly it grew and grew and grew, and there you are. So that's to be, you're present without, you're present within by being aware of thoughts that may come. When you recognize it, you don't actually need this thought right now, and it's not important in this moment. You let it go. When that moment comes that the thought refers to, then perhaps it'll be important then, but it's not important now. Next level is emotions. Can you feel any emotion in this moment as you sit or stand there? Maybe not, maybe yes. And then whatever it is, that is, okay. There's always the awareness of what is there outside and inside. So that's thought level, emotional level, and then the most important, And that's the real core of it, is as you sit there, present within, present without, at the deepest level of being present within, you are aware of awareness. You are self-aware, or the awareness that ultimately you are, the awareness that is the essence of who you are, is aware of itself. It sounds a little strange at first, but as I speak, hopefully you can experience it in this very moment, without past and future, here and now. What does it mean to be aware that you are aware? You are conscious and you know that you are conscious. And there's no content to it, there's just a space of consciousness. You know, another way of putting it, I'll give you various signposts, because some signposts was better for certain people, so people relate to different signposts. You remain with the fact of when you sit somewhere, there's the external world, and then there's the afterthoughts and emotions. When they subside, you become aware of something deeper, and that is the bare and simple fact, I am, which is the same thing as saying you become conscious of being conscious. The simple fact of being, of I am. To be, being, the verb to be is the infinitive. I am is the first person singular of the verb to be. So they're the same thing. They look like totally different words for some strange reason. In many languages it's like that. With most words you have the infinitive is the same as the first person and second person. I speak, to speak, and I speak. To do, I do. But to be, I am. Whereas you should really be saying I be, because it's being. In some Germanic languages you still have that. The German I am is ich bin, B-I-N, which goes back to the be, I be. So I am, to sense the being that you are without any addition. It's not I am this, that, or that, not even a man or a woman, or not any age, old, young, or old, or a great success or a great failure, or whatever the mind concept the mind comes up with. None of that. All that remains of you is the realization of being. I am. And that is inherently joyful. At first it may be very subtle. You may not even know what I am, okay? Mind subsides. You're still aware of your surroundings. You could close your eyes too and just remain with the feeling of I am. But if you leave your eyes open and other senses are still alert, you can be beautifully aware of your surroundings and at the same time aware of yourself as that which makes all those sense perceptions possible. Without the consciousness, what would there be? Without the consciousness that makes sense perception possible, would there be a flower? Or anything? A tree? That's a philosophical question. Don't follow it, don't go there now, because it takes us into thinking. So, and the beauty of this is then you have being, you're in the being, you're rooted in being, and at the same time you're still in this world. You have not completely, you're present in this world. And this world You perceive it in a different way because it is not being perceived through the veil of conceptualization, but pure awareness. And there's a beauty to it that before you couldn't see. There's not only beauty in an external sense of the word, there's something that you can sense that underlies the sense-perceived universe, something that underlies every life form, an energy field, an underlying intelligence, whatever you want to call it, something, a deeper aliveness. Why can you sense it out there? Because you can sense it in yourself. The totally invisible you, that is the essence of who you are. When you can then sense it in yourself, you sense it in nature, and when you sense it in nature, what you are also aware of at the same time is, to use a word that's no longer much in use, people don't know what to do with it, and the word is the sacredness of nature. You can sense there's something. Yes, it's beautiful on this, all the sense perception, the surface is beautiful, but you realize what you're looking at is the surface, and beyond the surface there's something sacred. Now, sacred to many people means, what do you mean sacred? Does it? And even if you go to a dictionary, you will not find a satisfactory definition of sacred. It doesn't really explain it. It says it's connected with religious beliefs, or it's worshipping to a deity and all kinds of things like that. Nature as sacred, that humans had that until not that long ago. Humans had a natural sense of the sacredness of nature, if you go back even a few hundred years. In all cultures, they had a natural, intuitive way of relating to nature. They could recognize something in nature that they couldn't define. And why can't modern humans do that? Probably because in modern humans, the mind is even more absurdly overactive than it would be in humans that lived in past ages, whose mind was also active, but there was still a little bit enough space left in between their mind activity in order to relate to nature deeply and to recognize something there. The sense that the entire world actually that surrounds you is spiritual, that it is animated by a spiritual presence, that was prevalent throughout almost all cultures. They expressed it in different ways. The ancient Romans, they had, to them everything had a spirit. A tree had a spirit. Their house had a spirit. Every house had a little image dedicated to the spirit of that house. And even within the house, the fireplace was having a spirit, a spiritual presence. The world was animated spiritually. This is how they perceived the world, and not just nature, even places had spirits. There was, in the Romans, I think, called it animus loci or something like that. Anima loci, the soul of the place. So they could sense that in addition to what the senses show us, there is something deeper that underlies all that. And we could call that the universal consciousness that expresses itself through billions of life forms. And it underlies it, the organizing principle behind the continuously arising and subsiding forms of life. But how do the atoms know how to form a flower and the molecules? So there's there's an intelligence that underlies the physical, the phenomenal universe. And so then something happened, which probably started in the early 19th century, maybe even before. The world became despiritualized. Humans began to think that we inhabit basically a dead and lifeless universe, that they could no longer sense the presence inherent in all things. And this is the price we had to pay for science, which was a wonderful thing, but the universe became one-dimensional, and humans lost the ability to go deep. Something happened with Darwin, of course. It affected everybody. It took 100 years to reach everybody. It affected every human, even humans who had never even heard of Darwin, or the origin of this theory of evolution and all that it affected everybody because it seeped into the collective consciousness, the belief that we inhabit a totally random universe that is actually totally meaningless because everything are random developments, and there's no intelligence behind it whatsoever. It's all chance. It's a chance accumulation of atoms over billions of years that brings about. There was, I would suggest, the theory of evolution was not totally wrong, but it missed something, and I would say that there is a guiding intelligence behind the evolutionary process. So I wouldn't deny evolution, but there's something behind it that gradually expresses it more and more fully in this dimension. But there's still the belief in that it's all, and then came despair, then came expressed in paintings, expressed in literature, the despair of meaninglessness, and it affected and still affects millions of people. The world they inhabit is dead, it's meaningless, and they feel disconnected from everything and everybody. And that's what we could call that nihilism. Nihilism is a dreadful mental dysfunction that is very prevalent in our age, and that is one reason why millions cannot live without some kind of medication to combat the terrible, the mental emotional pain that comes with that. And it's all to do with disconnectedness from being. And again, other cultures, ancient Norse, the Druids in England, very strongly venerated nature. The ancient Germanic tribes that later invaded Italy and the Roman Empire, and the barbarians, as the Romans called them, they were simple people, full of energy, and had a strong relationship with nature. They would meet, often have sacred meetings. There were certain places, groves of trees were regarded as extremely sacred, and they would often meet there. And can you imagine how these people going into a sacred grove of trees and in a sense of awe and veneration, they could sense this incredible energy field, and then they would go, wow. And you can do the same here. And perhaps even deeper than that, because there's an added dimension to you as you're awakening spiritually, because you know it's in you. And so I suggest that you use this opportunity, with beautiful nature here, really give it attention and be quiet with it, and then sense what it means, what sacredness means. And perhaps humans, well, not perhaps, certainly humans, the fact that humans have become so destructive towards nature is that they first of all they had to lose the ability to sense the sacredness of nature. So if you approach a forest and you cannot sense the sacredness of an ancient forest, then the forest to you is nothing much. It's just timber, the prospect of timber, and you cut it, and then to say, okay, well, we'll cut it, then it'll give us that amount of profit, and then yes, we'll replant it. Well, that's better than not. But to an ancient forest has an enormous spiritual presence, and this cannot be immediately recreated by planting new trees. And forest that has been there for 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years has an incredible spiritual presence. So the Romans were not wrong. And so part of the ecology is we need to rediscover the lost ability to deeply relate to nature. And it's such a great help for you to be present. Just a wonderful reflection. But now the mind needs to be still while you perceive nature. And the senses are alert. The mind is still. And then you're aware of what's out there, and you're aware of what's within, which is the I am, the awareness, the stillness. And then when you're aware of the stillness, then you are aware of something that's out there that is deeper than the sense perceptions, that shines through what we might call beauty. Something is there you're becoming aware of the sacredness of nature because you're becoming aware of the sacredness of yourself. It's a mystery, something you cannot analyze it. It is much vaster than anything that you could think of. Impossible to understand conceptually. You can know it, but not understand it conceptually. Perhaps we can have a few questions. This will be done I hope that one or two people have been chosen to, not to ask the questions, but to choose the questioners. Because I can't do it from here, you wouldn't know who I'm pointing at, because if 10 hands go up there and I go like this, you don't know. So we have one or two almighty beings. And there's a microphone here. You can come up, I believe, to the microphone. No need to hurry while you're walking to the microphone. We have plenty of time. We are not impatient. And we are not even trying to be patient. I'm trying to be patient. Somebody is approaching the microphone. Hi.
And I wrote this down because I confuse myself, you know. If consciousness is becoming aware of itself, okay, and time is an illusion or simultaneous, there is no time, that's the way I understand it, wouldn't consciousness already have become aware?
Oh. That's a very deep question.
A lot of thinking, right?
I'll have to think about that. Or better not think about it and see what comes up if I don't think about it. Because I know if I think about it, I'm not going to find the answer. So I will now not think about it. Oh, yes, I got it. What is consciousness? Of course, we cannot define what consciousness is. We can only be it, realize that we are it. And it seems to be a fact that this universe, in this universe, there is an evolutionary process. Time applies here, the dimension of time and space, and in this dimension there's a gradual evolutionary process where life becomes more and more complex. If you look at this planet alone, you have geological evidence that it started very simply with very simple organisms, and over billions, millions, and even billions of years, gradually life forms became more and more complex. So there was definitely time involved. And how could it become more complex? Because more consciousness was flowing into this dimension, but where was it coming from? And this gives me an opportunity to talk about God. I hope you don't mind. I will now explain what God is. Not exactly, nobody can explain it, but it's like this. The source of all life is not part of this dimension. It's not subject to time or space. It is beyond space and time. And I compare God in this sense-perceived universe, to the sun. The sun is the life giver. The sun is not eternal, but we might as well call it eternal, because compared to our lifespan, it just goes on and on and on for millions of years. An outpouring of a continuous emanation of energy, enabling physical life to be here. So it's not surprising that many ancient cultures thought of the sun as God. So I'm using the sun as an analogy. If you now imagine the source of all life existing, not even to exist is not the wrong term, because to exist means that the word means to stand out. Ex means out. Ist from the stand. Anything that exists, stands out, is manifest. It has a form. It exists. God does not exist in that sense of the word. God is, but does not exist, because God does not stand out as an entity, as something that is somewhere in space or time. God is prior to space and time in a totally different dimension, and from the dimension, the timeless dimension, the source, where the source dwells, the source gradually shines into this dimension, like the sun. It emanates consciousness, which is the light of God, into this dimension. And in this dimension, then we perceive it as a gradual evolutionary process where more light gradually increases in this dimension. It's like gradually you turn on the dimmer switch more and more, but it takes millions of years, billions of years for the light to grow. The light grows. So the consciousness that you are and the consciousness that enables all life forms to be and to evolve is the emanation from the one source of all life. It emanates from there into this dimension. And in this dimension, there is therefore an evolutionary process. The source itself is beyond time and space. There's no... Nothing happens. There's no growth. We cannot talk about it. We cannot understand it. It's totally beyond comprehension. So the important thing to know is that what Jesus called the light of the world, which is consciousness, we cannot be anything else, and said, you are the light of the world. But really, the light of the world is the light of God, coming into this dimension and gradually creating life forms, increasingly complex life forms in this dimension. That is the outgoing principle of the creation of the world. The creation of the universe hasn't been accomplished yet. It is a work in progress. The creation of humans is not done yet. Humans are not... humans also are still undergoing a creative process. I mean, it would be, just imagine human beings already fully created and complete. No, that would not be a great job. Because I mean, if and then you can say, is this the best you can do? And it obviously is not. It's a work in progress. There's a gradual. It's in St. Paul. St. Paul had some great mystical insights. He even talked. He talked about the birth pangs, the pain of giving birth in this universe. The entire universe is experiencing the pain of birthing. And so this is the suffering that we see that has a certain reality, but from a higher transcendental viewpoint is a kind of nightmare that is part of the evolutionary process of the one being that incarnates as countless, manifold beings throughout the universe. So that there's always a paradox when you discovered a paradox, and that's good. There's always a paradox when we talk about that dimension and this dimension. So even when we say about we are becoming more present, but you experience the possibility, yes, you are becoming more present. But there's a paradox, because you say, well, present, isn't that... doesn't that mean timelessness? And how can I become more timeless in time? But we have to live with these paradoxes because they apply to totally different dimensions and levels of discourse. So, but it's a good question. Thank you.
Laughter. Could you speak to us of laughter? Now there's laughter that comes not well-meaning when you're laughing at somebody.
Yes.
Sometimes you laugh with somebody, and that's a kind of better... Well, to me, it's a more acceptable laughter. I prefer that. But then occasionally, there is a laughter that just comes from nowhere, and I don't know, it's sort of from the heart. It's not for any reason, but it's very rich, very deep, and very lovely. Can you address that?
Okay.
Did I make myself kind of clear?
Yes.
Okay.
Do you laugh spontaneously sometimes, or does it just come, or do you have a thought that makes you laugh?
It's happened at the ashram with the guru. Sometimes animals will make me laugh.
Right.
Sometimes I just feel kind of
Right.
joyful.
Well, as you might have noticed, we laugh quite a bit here too.
Yes, I did.
And
I did.
that's a good thing. There are, by the way, many spiritual teachers, but if the spiritual teacher never laughs, then you should be careful. If he or she laughs a lot, that's already a good sign.
Yeah, there's a laughing meditation. You just made me think of that. There's a laughing meditation.
Yes, that's
done
right.
too.
No, that can be quite a release. I think it started in India, this practice, some years ago, or whenever it started. The groups, people get together and just start laughing. And that can be a great release of things that had been bottled up emotionally. It's a release. But laughter can also come as a sign that you are aware of you are detached from you're not taking the world all that seriously anymore. And why are you not taking the world all that seriously anymore? Because you realize that it may be of relative importance, whatever happens in the world, it certainly is. But you are connected to something deeper from there. You can see many of the absurdities, things that the world regards as important, things that the egoic self values. You begin to laugh at yourself, which preferably rather than others, or you can laugh at the ego in general. You can laugh at how the human behavior that is motivated by the ego. When you are connected with the deeper dimension, which I call the essence identity, then instead of reacting to the ego in others, thereby amplifying your own ego, you can laugh or smile at the ego when you observe it in others, which means you're not laughing at them, you're laughing at the ego in them. So it's not, there's another laughter that you mentioned that comes from ego itself. You laugh at somebody because it makes you feel superior. You want to demean that person. You're laughing, he or she is of less worth than you, so you're laughing. That's one of the many things, one of the many ego strategies that makes the ego feel superior to somebody else. So that's not what it is. There's also a thing called smile that's related to laughter. It's not quite as outgoing, but I remember when I first started seeing, many years ago, I started seeing people for spiritual counseling. And a lot of, when you see people, you listen to their stories usually, and they tell the stories. And very often I found myself slightly smiling while I was listening to their story, so I was going. And they were talking, they were saying, "You know what he did to me then? I just never forget it. It was 20 years ago, but I think about it every day still. It was so awful," and I would listen. And then sometimes people got very angry, say, "Why are you laughing at me? I'm telling you this story and you are laughing at me?" No. Now, I found it hard to explain why I was smiling. I wasn't actually laughing, but I was smiling. Why was I smiling when I'm listening to a very sad story?
Yeah.
And the reason is that I could sense the relative unreality of the story. I could sense not only my own deeper reality, I could also sense the other person's deeper being that was beyond the narrative, the unhappy narrative. I could sense their essence identity. I could sense their completeness, where they're already healed, where no healing is necessary. By sense, and this is so pleasant to sense that which underlies all this pain, that is not touched by the pain. I was smiling because I could feel it in myself, but I could also feel the beautiful essence of that person that was sitting there with me. And that actually was recognized by some people as a form of healing. I never consciously practiced healing, just by being in the state of complete presence and recognizing the deeper essence of that human being there, that on the surface of the personality was in suffering because it was identified with a narrative and an emotional field. That is also a form of healing. So when you can be present with somebody who is in pain, then that is a deep form of healing. Not everybody may be open to it. So for the first time I knew it when I was talking to a lady who talked to me about her emotional pain, and I smiled a bit, and she didn't get angry. She said, "Oh, I can feel that you are doing healing now." And that's when I realized, because I was learning myself. I didn't know much when I started seeing people. I always started seeing people with having no idea what the solution to their problems are. And I was just listening. And then when the lady told me you're doing healing, then I realized, oh, it's healing. I didn't know that before.
So this is almost like a mother smiling at the child's misadventures.
Yes,
Aha.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's very liberating also, that smile, the laughter there's a kind of spiritual laughter that is very liberating because you can see, especially at the ego, and because a lot of things that we laugh about is we recognize human behavior that is motivated by ego, and once you have certain detachment and you can laugh, and the ego dislikes that intensely. The ego does not like to be laughed at. And if you can discover it in yourself, when you remember when you were still ego-dominated, which you are not now, of course, you may remember things that you said or you did, then you can smile or laugh. Hopefully you don't cringe or you're ashamed of what you did. This could happen too, but it can become ego again. If you can laugh, that means you're free, and you see the absurdity of many aspects of life. So there's a sense of detachment. You may have noticed, for example, Buddha images. Buddha images, by the way, they came much later. I believe there were at least 500 or 600 years after the death of the Buddha. There were no Buddha images, so they came much later. And to me, a Buddha image doesn't really refer to a historical person. To me, a Buddha image symbolizes a state of consciousness, and it can be very beautiful. And the best Buddha images done by great artists who were connected to in themselves to their own, to use a Buddhist term in some traditions, say Buddha nature. You can sense your Buddha nature, and therefore you can sense the Buddha nature in every being. That's how it works. And the artist then gave the Buddha just a hint of a smile. Yeah. The not so good Buddhas look very serious. They're even scary. They look. And then there are others who have the hint of a smile, and it's very calming to look at them. And you might ask, well, the human mind would ask, what are they smiling about? Especially if you remember that the Buddha said, all life is suffering, and the essence of all life is nothingness. And so, well, why is he smiling? Because that's very sad. Of course, it's a complete misunderstanding of what he was talking about. When the essence of life is not nothingness, it's a mistranslation. It's spaciousness, no form, formlessness. Sunyata, spaciousness. Emptiness is a usual translation, but it's not a very good translation. Spaciousness, good. Suffering is, yes, all life is suffering as long as you are, as long as you have, and as long as you are a self. When you have a self, then you suffer because you identify with your form exclusively. That's the ego. As long as that's there, life is suffering. But people forget when they say Buddhist teaching is negative, life-denying, or even nihilistic. They forget that he said, I teach suffering and the end of suffering. Now, the end of suffering, of course, very wisely, is not, when he said the end of suffering, nobody knows what is that? What is the end of suffering? And then academics who study Buddhism say, well, it's extinction of life or something like that. But it's not. It's the end of suffering is the end of the delusion of the self. And the end of suffering is a negative term because it doesn't give you anything to believe in or to make a mental idol out of. Jesus used various positive terms, mostly, but not always. So he talked about eternal life or the kingdom of heaven or the fullness of life. And that is the same thing that he's pointing to, expressing it in a positive terminology. The kingdom of heaven, which is, in my translation, the dimension of spaciousness. Kingdom, dimension. Heaven, vast spaciousness. The kingdom of heaven that is within you, it is the inner spaciousness of consciousness, the unconditioned consciousness. The kingdom of heaven that he said, when they asked him, where is the kingdom of heaven and when is it going to come? He said, the kingdom of heaven cannot be observed there are no signs with which that you can perceive. You can never say, oh, it's over here or it's over there. He said, you can't say that because the kingdom of heaven is within you. But of course it's also without, it's within you. So the kingdom of heaven is a state of consciousness. That is the end of suffering. The Buddha didn't want to give you something to transform into a mental idol, which when you give a positive term in a teaching, which is a signpost, people take the positive term and begin to believe in it, and then Christians have done that, despite the fact that Jesus very clearly said the kingdom does not come with signs to be perceived. Nevertheless, they disregarded that, and then they say the kingdom of heaven exists somewhere or it's going to come. But he clearly said it does not come with signs to be perceived. You can never say there it is. And what is the one thing of which you can never say, which can never become an object of consciousness? The consciousness itself. Everything itself can be an object, but consciousness cannot be an object. Consciousness is the eternal subject. So you cannot transform consciousness into an object of perception and say, there's my consciousness. Who is talking? So that's the Buddha is smiling because he is connected with the transcendent dimension. He represents the image itself represents the transcendent dimension of consciousness, the kingdom of heaven. So that's why there's a smile, a slight smile, and I'm sure the Buddha also laughed quite a lot. But you sometimes see in the Taoist Buddhas, which are influenced by, it's a mixture of Taoism and Buddhism, in the Chinese Taoist Buddhas, some of them are actually laughing Buddhas. They're usually quite fat.
Yeah.
Their belly is much bigger than mine, and they sit there and go, and they laugh, and it's a benevolent laughter. They're not laughing at you. They're laughing. Yes, and they're laughing also because they can sense the joy of life. And the joy of life sometimes makes you just laugh. It's a spontaneous laughter. So it's a liberating thing. Laughter can be very, very liberating. It's an essential part of this teaching, the fact that things are nothing is taken too seriously. There's a lightness. Especially, you don't take yourself too seriously. The spiritual teacher should not take him or herself too seriously, because then there's something not quite right. Yeah. So be aware of non-laughing gurus. Thank you.
Hello. This question is quite personal, so it's of course okay to pass.
Personal about yourself?
About yourself.
I don't know if that's helpful.
Maybe you can make it more broad, but my understanding, I don't know if it's correct, is that you don't have children, and I'm wondering your coming to that decision or your thoughts or feelings around that. Thank you.
Thank you. It just never happened. I mean, the children didn't happen, but there was never a decision that I never decided that I wanted children, nor did I ever decide that I didn't want children. But circumstances were such that it didn't happen, and I had very few relationships as an adult, most of my adult life. Into my 40s, and so as far as I know, and I'm almost sure it didn't happen.
I know it goes against your teachings, but I've been anticipating this moment if it ever happened. And actually, the last question kind of helped me transition into my question. First of all, I want to thank you for the healing that's happened in my life and the people that I come in contact with because of your teachings. It means the world to me. Practice in presence has changed my life, as I've said. But there's still an area that I seem to struggle. I have a very physical, demanding job in construction, and I have 6 children and a beautiful wife, in which this is our honeymoon that we postponed to celebrate this time together.
Oh, wonderful.
The dangers of my job and the physical challenges, I try to turn it into a spiritual practice with presence continuously. However, after a 12 to 14-hour day, when I get home to my wife and 6 children, physically I am drained. And it's very difficult for me to continue practice and presence with my family, who means the most to me. Can you share some wisdom on how to continuously practice presence when physically exhausted?
Right. Now, of course, on a purely practical level, there are things you can do when you arrive home and you know that you're exhausted, so that you're not become unconscious. I don't know whether what you're saying implies that when you arrive home, you begin to behave in a somewhat unconscious way towards your children or your wife. Does it imply
Well,
that?
it's more that my mind is saying you need to rest right now, and therefore I can become unconscious if I don't feel that that's appreciated.
Right. Well, on a practical level, you take necessary steps to recover. Perhaps you can have some kind of ritual, I don't know what. You take a shower or lie in the bathtub or whatever it is, or go out into nature, practice a little bit of breathing while you lie on the grass or under a tree.
Or listen to Eckhart.
Yeah, not a bad idea. So know that this is always a critical moment when it's a challenging moment, and your family knows it too. You can tell your wife and your children, if they're old enough to know what you're talking about, that if you behave in a way that is you would not normally behave, you say something that's not in anger or irritation because you're physically depleted, it can't be present. You could give them permission to point it out to you. And then when it happens, then even in the physically weak, depleted state, you may find that you are actually able to still be not perhaps as acutely present, but you may find in the background there can still be a present even then. This is an interesting question that perhaps many people can relate to in their personal lives, and that is when you get tired or you've been working very hard. It is easier to be taken over by either certain thoughts or certain moods or emotions because there's less alertness. And so often people become irritated after a long day at work. They can't take anymore and they become irritated. If you know beforehand that this is going to be a critical time when you get home, you can have some alertness and make that your spiritual practice, that even while you are physically depleted, there can still be an awareness in the background. In addition to taking practical steps of perhaps breathe for 10 minutes out in nature, so to get the energy moving in a calm way, breathe into the belly, feel the energy spreading from the belly into the rest of the body, and then energy can quickly come back to some extent, not as much as in the morning perhaps, but it is. So there's the practical steps you can do for regenerating, and then there's the other steps is knowing that this is a time when you need to be doubly careful, present, and give your children especially your wife permission to say that I know you're tired and you're losing awareness right now, and let's see how that works, or just a little sign that only she knows about, whatever you want to, a little sign. And then that could bring you back into presence. If you get angry after giving her permission beforehand, and if the next day she does it and you get angry, that means you're really not present, and that's good to know too, and because then. You can give her permission to say you're really not present.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. So I want to ask a question about ego. So you taught us to reduce our egos, which has been, extremely helpful. Helped me get out of my depression. But I feel, in some aspect, my ego actually increased from, studying your work, especially like in a relationship. I try to explain your teaching to my wife, but she doesn't get it. And then sometimes she just get very angry and fits your description of, say, pain body behavior very well. Of course, I cannot say that to her. And then at the same time, I feel I'm superior to you. So, so I wonder if you can address these questions, especially the relationship. And, one person is an egghead, the other not.
Well, there's a couple of things here. One is there's certainly the danger of the ego can easily, just when you think you've transcended the ego to some extent or largely, just then the ego can come in through the back door. And for example, it can become a spiritual ego where you feel that you are actually more conscious than your wife. And there's no doubt about that. I'm more conscious than she is, obviously. That's what you tell yourself. And you don't realize the ego is always comparative. And the ego, whenever you compare yourself to somebody else, there's always some ego there. And so the spiritual ego is ego seeks superiority, one way or another. You can either be superior in victory as the great achiever, or you can be superior to others when more special than other in being the greatest victim. That works beautifully too. Whatever it is, you need some superiority. So whenever you detect the superiority towards others, then you feel, yes, there's the ego again. So the spiritual ego in spiritual seekers, very common, in a very subtle way. They feel superior, and now the question arises, well, aren't they superior? Well, yes and no. The essence in every human is that the consciousness. Every woman, you share the essence of who you are with every human. And if you do not recognize the essence in the other human, then you recognize the personality and you react to the personality and you take that to be who that person is, and then you feel superior and you have recreated your own ego. So that sense of empathy with others and equality with others comes where you no longer compare yourself to others in any area, and it feels comfortable. Now, the second important thing is never talk about presence to somebody who is not interested in presence. Never. And I would even if they never ask a question about it, don't talk about it. If it's a true question, then there's something perhaps you can say, and you may have to wait until a true question is being asked. The worst thing you can do is try to explain to somebody who is not interested and is not ready to hear about presence. That's extremely frustrating for both of you and not recommended. So if you live with somebody who is not interested, just the main thing is you practicing presence, you living presence. That's how you teach presence. The main way you can teach presence is by being present. That applies to children also. The children at home when instead of trying to explain something to children, just be present yourself and hold that space of presence. And whether or not your wife or somebody understands is no longer very important. You give up the need to be understood. This aspect of yourself, it makes no difference whether or not she understands presence or that you are present. Don't you notice that I'm present? The same thing with parents. Let's say you visit your parents, and your parents might have certain views about your life or whatever it is, and it's not uncommon for adult children to feel not being understood by their parents. The parents have a certain view of you, and they judge you in their way according to their conditioning. And some people feel very unhappy about that. They feel it's terrible that my father, my mother, they don't understand me. I'm trying to explain, when all they say is, are you still involved in that rubbish? Are you still reading Eckhart Tolle? Why don't you do something useful? And I'm trying to, they don't understand me, they don't know what's important to me. And that's so frustrating whenever I go there. Well, then I suggest a spiritual practice and begin to realize what difference does it make whether my parents, let's say they're parents, whether my parents understand me or not. Let's say suddenly you visualize, okay, now they understand me. The father says, now I completely understand you. Sorry, I didn't understand. For the first time, I now understand you. And you say, oh, great, thank you. What's the difference from before? Before he said, well, this is all wrong, what you're doing is all wrong. Okay, that's it's good. You have your opinions, that's fine. That's how it is. Nothing is added to you by being understood by somebody. It really makes no difference. Only to the ego. The ego wants to be appreciated and recognized and regarded as special. But without ego, there's just somebody who doesn't understand. My mother didn't understand me, and it was fine. She, for many years, regarded me as a failure, and because I hadn't achieved any worldly success. And I could see that she looked at me from the limitations of her conditioning, where she thought, well, if he hasn't achieved a good position, by the time he will reach the age of 40 or something, and he's squandered all the wonderful possibilities that he had by giving up his academic career, he's insane, you're insane. And so I allowed her to not understand me. It was fine. And there was a little bit of suffering I could see in her, but I couldn't help that. I cannot say, okay, I'm now becoming a stockbroker in order to alleviate your suffering. I'm now going to apply for a job on Wall Street, and then you will not suffer anymore. Or I'm going to become a lawyer, I'm becoming a doctor, I'm going to become this or that, so that you don't suffer anymore. That would be, you have to sometimes allow people around you to suffer, because it is self-created. You are not creating the suffering if you're not doing what they want you to do, and otherwise sometimes it's a bit like blackmail. Some unconscious parents do that. They blackmail their children, say, look what I have given up for you. Look, I've financed all this for you. I've given up so much, and now are you going to disappoint me? And so, and some young adults are pushed into something that they don't really want to do because they don't want to feel that guilt. And then, of course, it could take decades before they finally give it up and break out of that, of something that was not in alignment with where they needed to be, what they needed to evolve into. So the wonderful thing is becoming free of other people's view of you, and never, now this is a general recommendation, never try to explain anything spiritual unless you can see an opening in the other person, which sometimes may be a question. It may not even be a spiritual question, but it could be that your answer contains a spiritual element. The simplest thing, sometimes people, they really want to help a relative or somebody who is, you can do something very simple that doesn't sound spiritual whatsoever. Don't talk about awareness or consciousness or anything that's too much, or surrender, or that's too much. They won't like it. But you can say something like, I like to. Can you feel the inside of your hands? It really is. It's something very practical. Can you feel the inside of your hands, the energy inside? Just it's a game. You can do it with children too. Can you feel the inside of your hands? Can you feel they're alive? Maybe you have to close your eyes to feel it. Yeah, and then what? Well, now can you feel the inside of your feet too? Yeah, and can you feel your legs and then the rest of the body? It's a little thing that I sometimes do that feels very good. What they don't know, and you don't need to explain that, is when they begin to feel the inner body, they can't think very much anymore, because you can either think or feel the inner body. Breathing is another way to breathe consciously. These things can be explained without any additional terminology that they will not like. So sometimes these things are possible, but nothing beyond that unless there is an opening, there's a question. And realize how satisfying it is from now on that you will no longer attempt to explain anything to your wife, nor will you expect her to understand you. It's enough for you to be present while you're there. That's it, and that works.
Yes, it's a huge gift.
One more question, and then we'll have a little break.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you very much to the universe. I'm very grateful that this teaching has been offered to you, all of us, and that you answered the call so strongly. And it's about this call that I have a question. You spoke yesterday, or maybe Sunday night, about how the episodes of stillness will lengthen as your presence power grows. And since reading The Power of Now in 2011, the changes in my life have been miraculous. And literally transmutation, I don't even feel like the same person anymore. And so now I find myself organizing my life around stillness, to proverbially sit on the park bench and just contemplate the universe, and almost in ignoring my responsibilities. I'm a loving wife. I share a business with my husband. So could you talk a little bit about that experience when you were on the park bench, and how you were called to writing the book? And should I beckon the muse, or should I sit in stillness and wait till something happens?
All right, Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. No, it's wonderful if you can enjoy the stillness, if you can just be, and it feels wonderful to just, you take moments when you just be, that's beautiful. But an important step would be also to bring the doing and the being together so that they don't exist in your life as two separate things. They sometimes feel, okay, I need to take time for being, and which is a good thing if you don't overdo it. I overdid it, but that was fine too. I was meant to. I didn't have any guidance, so for 2 years or so, or 3, I was so immersed in being that I lost all interest in doing or in planning anything or any future. Being was so fulfilling that I didn't feel the need to do anything, and miraculously I survived, and I did not survive on unemployment benefit ever, so that would not have been miraculous. I survived in a miraculous way, so there's always at the last minute something happened. I got a little job there, or a little thing there, or somebody gave me some, and then at some point I was sitting on a park bench, somebody came, casual conversation, asked a question, I said something, and the person said, "Oh, what do you mean by that?" I said a bit more. Then the next day he came back, wanted to know a bit more. That was the beginning of a spiritual teaching, and that was the beginning of coming out of being into doing, without me knowing it, that this was happening. And so I am now doing quite a bit, but are still being. Now I must admit, in my case, the doing that I do, which is traveling and talking and so on, the doing is the purpose of the doing is to teach being. So, but it doesn't have to be. You can the art is to not to lose the being dimension even while you're engaged in doing it. It doesn't matter what kind of doing, unless it's a doing that is very, very difficult to reconcile with being. There might be a few things that are so unpleasant that you wouldn't want to do them because they cannot be reconciled. But many activities can be reconciled with being, so that the being and the doing come together. You don't lose connectedness with being while you're engaged in activities. That's you're practicing that already.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
and that's good. So you don't need to take an excessive amount of time away from act. Some amount is always beautiful, to take time away where you just be. That's beautiful. And then the other times you engage in activities, and even while you are very active, there's still the connectedness with being, and that's the beauty. You're able to feel that?
And so if I've fulfilled the primary purpose, is there a way to nudge?
Do you feel that the doing is not sufficient, or should be different, or should be more in alignment with the being, or what you're not satisfied with the doing that you do?
That's a wonderful question. It feels like something is inside that needs to come out, but I don't know what it is yet.
Yes.
And I wonder if I should be taking some steps to realize it. It's not like when I was in my ego and, oh, I got to do this, oh, I got to do this.
Right.
Yes.
Yes. Well, it is quite possible that there's something that wants to come out, and that's. I had something similar happen years after the shift in consciousness. I was doing I was still seeing people one-on-one. I was doing workshops. Okay, once a month I would do a workshop in various places in England. And that went on for a few years. And I had a strong feeling that there's more that I can do, much more. And it was kind of growing a bit, but not that fast. My first workshops had 4 or 5 people, and then after 2 years I got 15 people or 20 in a workshop. And well, once I had one person turn up for a weekend workshop. But I did it anyway. But there was a feeling that there's something, and then I was in a church in a small village in Somerset, and I asked the universe. I knew I was going where I was meant to go, but and I just said, I want acceleration, please. And that became a deep meditation, the wanting acceleration. And then that thought stayed with me for a while, and then it took 3 months maybe. At first nothing happened. Where's the acceleration? And then suddenly I woke up with knowing I had to leave England and I had to move to the west coast of North America. I didn't know what for, and I didn't know that was part of the acceleration. But it was so strong, it wasn't just one impulse that came one day, just a thought in my head. No, it came every day, and I knew after several weeks I have to do it. So there's something for me to do there. I knew that. I didn't know what. So I sold everything, didn't have a home anymore, and then I went on a plane and went over. And West Coast was British Columbia. At first I thought it must be California, but I saw somebody in British Columbia on the West Coast, and I booked the Greyhound bus to California. I stayed in somebody's home. Somebody offered me a room, and I knew very few people in the Bay Area. Somebody offered me a room, and one day I was sitting there in his kitchen, he was at work, and suddenly the Power of Now started, and I wrote, "What is enlightenment?" That's the beginning of the Power of Now. I had traveled over the years, I had done casual writings after seeing people for counseling. I had all these casual writings that I had taken, notes I had taken of what I had said to people, which I wouldn't have said if they hadn't been there, and I wouldn't have known if they hadn't come and asked. So I wrote down the answers. Then later I incorporated some of that into the writing, but that was a very different, empowered writing stream that suddenly happened. And still I didn't know that I had to be there. When my visa expired, I had to go back to England, didn't have a home anymore, lived in a commune for a while, couldn't do any writing. The energy field, I love England, I loved it and still love it, but the energy, and for other people, England may be perfect for writing. It was, in my case, I couldn't do the writing there. I needed the energy field of the West Coast for the writing to manifest. So then I went back to the West Coast, writing started again. Then I realized, okay, that's why I had to move. And that was the acceleration. And then the book came out after 3 years. And then I couldn't even imagine what acceleration. So that's how it happened. So something like this, who knows, may happen to you. You may be destined to be a spiritual teacher. Quite a few of you, if you're not already a spiritual teacher, are also destined to be, some in a more formal way, some in an informal way. So let's see what life, what consciousness wants to manifest through you. Thank you. Thank you. Let's take a little break.